You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis and Norman Richmond. And we just have concluded the Jazz Zone, and we were listening to West Montgomery featuring Paul Chambers, Winston Kelly, and Jimmy Cobb. And Winston Kelly passed away here in Toronto many years ago. He was an epileptic, and he had a seizure in Toronto, and he actually passed away here in Toronto. Winston Kelly, great pianist played many instruments, and he was Trinidadian and Jamaican. He had a Trinidadian and Jamaican background. He was born in New York City, and Winston Kelly is one of our favorites of all time. And we are on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne, who has a brand spanking new book out called Armed Struggle. It's about the Black Panther Party, and it is. I guess the first thing I want to ask you is, how is that book doing?
Oh, it's doing fine. I mean, it's about, the subtitle is actually Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. I've been doing lots of interviews about this book, many of which can be found online. And one of the conclusions I've arrived at is that there are those who think that in some ways, when some people started shouting Black Power when that era was inaugurated, that changed everything. Not necessarily the changing international climate with U.S. imperialism under pressure, seeking to compete with the socialist camp for hearts and minds and Africa and the Caribbean. That's set aside. And in some ways, I detect that there might be a tad of resentment towards this idea I'm putting forward, trying to put the retreat of Jim Crow in a global context by talking about the connections between communists in the United States and globally and the Panthers. I think there are those who would like to see the Panthers in isolation from those former forces, even though as part of political education, the Panthers were reading not only, of course, Fanon, Martinican, Algerian, Cabral, Guinea-Bissau, but Che Guevara, Ho Chi Minh, etc. So seeking to place them in isolation in a sort of Black American context, it might do favors for a certain approach in North America, which, by the way, is having difficulty in explaining contemporary reality. That is to say, how and why it is that you have this spectacular litany of police slayings of Black people. How does that tie in to the origins of the United States? How does it tie into anti-Blackness? How it ties into enslavement of Africans? How it ties in to the fact that enslaved property was expropriated without compensation? I even got an email from a person who objected to my mentioning that, because by mentioning that, he says that I'm not sure why. I mean, it's people don't like their property taken without compensation. Plus, I tied that to the rise of anti-communism, because socialism is allied with this idea of seizing private property without compensation. Then people like Robeson become the face of socialism, and then that helps to turbocharge anti-Blackness. I just think that there's this felt need amongst some, perhaps even many in our community, to steer clear of multifaceted explanations, to steer in favor of simple explanations. And as I said about the NAACP at one time in this book, they were very good at singing the blues, not so good at coming up with remedies. And I would say that's true not only for the NAACP, it's true, it's a tendency. I mean, I think people are comfortable with singing the blues, but doing something about it is another thing. I mean, I was on Carl Nelson's show just this past week, and it was mentioned that the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith is being sued by Black folk. And the caller was tending to suggest that just the fact of filing a lawsuit was a victory. But I don't see that. I mean, anybody, I mean, as a lawyer, I can tell you, it's easy in the United States to file a lawsuit. The question is, how do you prevail in a lawsuit? And so I don't know if it's just that our horizons have been shrunk to the point where we're not conceiving of being victorious. We're not conceiving of attaining victories. So anyway, those are some of my impressions with regard to being on tour, so to speak, talking about this new book.
Let me ask you this question now. The term Black Power, has been attributed to Mukasa, Willie Ricks, Kwame Ture, but I think people have forgotten the fact that Richard Wright wrote a book, I don't know, 54, 55, I don't know the exact date. He wrote a book called Black Power, before any independent country was in Africa other than Ethiopia and Liberia.
Well, sure. I mean, believe it or not, when I published my book on boxing a few years ago, I talk about Jack Johnson, of course, who in some ways was more politically advanced than boxers of the late 20th century, insofar as he was trying to set up an exile community across the border of Mexico. I talk about Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, and his relationship with forces on the left, including forces in the orbit of the Communist Party. And I had a person who I thought was a friend of mine, a fellow scholar. He actually wanted to physically manhandle me because he thought that I was encroaching on this idea that politicized boxers do not arise until Muhammad Ali in the 1960s. I mean, that's part of this whole thought that everything begins in the 1960s. Now, obviously, that makes comfortable a number of people who came to maturity in the 1960s. They can claim that history begins with them. But I don't think it does justice to our ancestors, and it doesn't do justice to history. It doesn't do justice to the past, but that's what I'm grappling with now.
Let me say that Joe Louis was actually, I remember reading, Joe Louis was in Cuba after the revolution. Joe Louis went to Cuba, and, there was a delegation of a mixture of mostly African, I guess it was a delegation of African Americans, Harold Cruz, and Joe Louis was there, and they supported the Cuban Revolution in 1959.
Yeah, there are pictures from that era, in fact. I mean, we need deeper thinking about this point that I'm referencing, this idea that but for these folks beginning to shout and chant Black Power and beat their chests with their fists, there was hardly anything going on. Now, I understand why some might come to that conclusion, because after all, there had been this era of Jim Crow and apartheid and lynching and slavery. But it's not as if people weren't struggling against it. And it's not as if you could talk about the breakthrough in the 1960s without talking about the aforementioned, which is the international climate changing. And that brings me to the other point that I've been stressing, which is that not only does this failure to have a comprehensive view of why change takes place handicaps us in terms of shedding light on this horrific litany of police slayings, the latest one being Sonia Massey in Springfield, Illinois. And of course, if you don't have an analysis, it's difficult to come up with a remedy, which is what we should be about. But sometimes, as noted, with regard to filing lawsuits, the question of remedy gets lost in the sauce. But likewise, a few hundred miles west of Sonia Massey in Springfield, Illinois, you had the defeat in her primary of Cori Bush of my hometown, St. Louis, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, who was defeated not least because of intervention by the Zionist lobby in support of her opponent, and because many in our community are missing in action when it comes to international questions, not even following what's going on in the world. And if you're not following it, how can you do anything about it? But then, just like that leaves us handicapped in terms of explaining Sonia Massey, it leaves us handicapped in terms of explicating what happened to Cori Bush, or better still, defending Cori Bush and keeping her from being defeated. So once again, these are just some of my random thoughts as I go from podcast to podcast and YouTube interview to YouTube interview discussing this latest book.
Well, let me ask you one more question, and we'll get off of this. What do you think about, like the current press, the Black radical press, the Burning Spear, the Final Call, and we don't have a lot of Black newspapers on the left. Do you think that? Do you attribute that to the the whole internet question and the cost of printing a newspaper, or do you think it's a problem in terms of getting international? Are we in a different era, or am I just an old man that's caught up in newspapers, or people are into the social media situation as opposed to a hard copy of a newspaper?
Well, that's part of it, but part of the problem is reading in general. I mean, I think that's one of our problems. A lot of folks in our community, they're not reading. And if you're not reading, I don't see how you can keep up with what's going on. And certainly they're not reading books. I would be happy if they were reading newspapers. But as we know, just to zoom out for a moment, newspapers across the board are going through hard times. I mean, in the United States, I'm talking about the bourgeois press. It's no guarantee, for example, that the Los Angeles Times will be around in a decade or so. And I would say the same for the Washington Post, for example. So it's part of a crisis of literacy. It's a crisis of politics, which leads to a crisis of comprehension of complex events. It's a polycrisis, to use a recently minted term. It's a multi-layered crisis, of which the collapse of the Black Panther newspaper and the reduction of circulation in papers of that genre are only part of that larger crisis.
Melinda Francis, you have some questions.
Yeah, who is Richard Gibson?
Oh,
or did we go there?
Well, that ties in to what I was just discussing. Let me tread carefully. Richard Gibson is in his 90s now. He was unmasked a few years ago as a CIA agent, a Black CIA agent, in fact. And before that, he had sued successfully those who had claimed he was a CIA agent. I'm not sure what's going to happen to those judgments. In any case, I mention him, because he comes up in my book, Armed Struggle. He wrote regularly for the LA Herald Dispatch, front page stories, misleading the audience about African liberation movements, attacking Amilcar Cabral, for example. And as a matter of fact, one of his books is called African Liberation Movements, wherein he gives a shout out to all of these different CIA fronts, like UNITA of Angola, Carimo of Mozambique, etc. You mentioned Richard Wright. He also has been accused credibly of creating an uncomfortable atmosphere in Paris for Richard Wright and his comrades on the left, including the late cartoonist Ollie Harrington.
Yes, sir.
And let me just conclude by saying this. And the reason I'm treading carefully is that one time I mentioned some of these things on a listserv. I don't recall if these were these email communication boards. And somehow my message was transmitted to Richard Gibson, and he threatened to sue me. So I'm careful. He's rather litigious, as they say. But in any case, he has a massive archive at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., which I have used and I have cited. And in that archive are a number of bombshells, including correspondence with leading so-called Black Power figures. This is how it ties into our previous discussion. And whenever I have a microphone before me, I suggest that interested scholars and writers should explore that archive. In fact, I think that I have enticed a celebrated, not to be named documentary filmmaker to use that archive, which also has visual images, to do a film about Gibson, because I don't expect him to be in the land of the living for that much longer.
Let me ask you one question about the Herald Dispatch. I remember the Herald Dispatch. I remember they did quite a few stories on my situation when I refused to go to the when I refused to go to Vietnam, and I think the editor was an African American woman who I think was conservative. She may have been in the Republican Party, and I know that Malcolm X and Allah Akbar Muhammad, aka Johns of Shabazz, who was the minister at Temple 27. I used to listen to him all the time. He grew up in St. Louis. They used to lay out the paper. They learned how to lay out a paper through this particular woman. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, she's in the book. Pat Alexander is her name. Very eclectic, as they say.
That's her.
On the one hand, sort of a Black militant, as represented by her covering your case. In fact, what's in my book on your case comes from the LA Herald Dispatch under her editorship. But on the other hand, comrade with Richard Gibson publishing his stories on the front page of the paper, for example. Also, her anti-Zionism oftentimes bled into anti-Jewish bigotry, which brought her into conflict with Cyril Briggs, roots in Nevis, a founder of the African Blood Brotherhood in the World War I era, but who migrates to Los Angeles and is a central figure in my pages. Check it out.
Cyril Briggs was one of my heroes. I remember he was a very light-skinned guy and he stuttered. And I think Marcus Garvey called him a white man pretending to be black. And I remember they say he stood up in Harlem and spoke for about a half an hour and never stuttered one time. And he sued Garvey, and I think he won. I'm pretty certain he did win. I heard him speak in Montreal. Tall, striking man, yeah. He was born in Barbados, right? And he was quite a figure. I guess you met you met him before, I presume, Gerald.
No, I did not. And in fact, I may want to correct this. My book says his roots were in Nevis.
They could be, but I always thought I always thought Barbados, but I've heard Nevis too. But no, you're probably correct. Nevis, Farrakhan, and Cecily Tyson, they have roots in Nevis. And something tells me that Mr. Richard B. Moore, I think you are absolutely right. Yes.
But anyway, once again, let me reiterate, there's a rich archive of Richard Gibson at George Washington University. It's one of the richest archives in the entire field of Black studies. Let's just leave it at that.
All right, Melinda, you have some more questions?
Yeah, let's get into Malaysia and Thailand joining BRICS.
So BRICS is on a roll right now. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It's contributing to the crisis of U.S. imperialism. We all know about the invitations to Egypt and Ethiopia and Saudi Arabia and Iran and the United Arab Emirates to join BRICS. They'll be meeting in Russia in a month or two. And we should not only expect invitations to Malaysia and Thailand, do not be surprised if there are invitations extended to Indonesia and Algeria. And this is just one of important summits that will be taking place. For example, as we speak, the South African Development Community is meeting in Zimbabwe. It's one of the more powerful entities on the African continent. And at the same time that SADC, the Southern African Development Community, I hope I said Southern African Development Community, is meeting in Zimbabwe, Tanzania, a member of SADC, is engaged in military maneuvers with the Chinese military off the coast of Dar es Salaam. I mentioned that for a number of reasons. One is I've noticed of late that the press coverage of Tanzania and President Hassan has turned negative in the United States. So do not be surprised if there's an attempted so-called color revolution in Tanzania, which would lead to her being dislodged. But another reason I mentioned the SADC meeting is that you should also expect an attempt somehow for US imperialism and its sidekicks in Ottawa, London, etc., to try to change either their relationship with Zimbabwe or change the regime in Zimbabwe. Because it has dawned upon them that Zimbabwe is a storehouse of lithium, important to the green economy, not to mention cobalt, manganese, chrome, etc. And because the United States has led a boycott of Zimbabwe that has compromised its ability to take advantage of these natural resources in this Southern African neighbor of South Africa. So once again, they're either going to have to change the relationship to ZANU-PF, the ruling party, or they're going to have to accelerate their attempt to dethrone ZANU-PF. And perhaps, given the fact that we're talking about US imperialism, which is a master at duplicity, they'll probably adopt both approaches. That is to say, regime change and changing relationships with the regime.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. We're on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne. Could you talk about the axis of resistance, Israel and NATO? We talk about, some are calling it the war of nerves. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, what's happening is, as we all know, a few weeks ago, the Israeli pirates engaged in typical Murder Incorporated type activity, killing a leader of Hezbollah, their southern Lebanon antagonists, in Beirut, killing a leader of Hamas in Tehran, Iran, at the time of the presidential inauguration, believe it or not, which was really a slap in the face of the Iranians. Since that time, we've been expecting a retaliation by the axis of resistance led by Iran. It has not arrived. And so analysts, including myself, have been trying to figure out what's going on. So one analysis I put forward is that the axis of resistance is engaged in a kind of war of nerves with the Israelis. That is to say, by having a threat of retaliation looming, they're enhancing and exacerbating the crisis in Israel. The economy in Israel is losing altitude by the hour. People are fleeing. Israel was once called the startup nation because of its ability to take advantage of developing these so-called unicorn, billion-dollar enterprise based upon various aspects of the internet. But now it's becoming a kind of shutdown nation, as it is suggested that of the 10 million over which Israel rules, most of whom are, of course, Jewish, only a few 100,000 are the intellectual and technological locomotive of that country. And that few 100,000 mostly have dual passports, which means they are leaving in droves, which is really compromising the Israeli economy at a time when retaliation by the axis of resistance may be on tap. Now, I should add that part of the reason why the axis of resistance may not have retaliated thus far is because off the coast of Israel is a major U.S. military flotilla, including, as I understand it, nuclear submarines. And that may be a restraining factor because part of the strategy of Israel is to have U.S. imperialism do its dirty work by attacking Iran. And it's thought that if the axis of resistance led by Iran attacks Israel, then U.S. imperialism will have a rationale, a permission structure, to use the current buzzword here in the United States, to authorize a military strike against Iran, which would open the gates of hell and would also probably help to rescue Mr. Netanyahu from the dismal fate that awaits him once this conflict begins to recede, because he'll have to face corruption charges. So it's a very complicated situation in that part of the world. And I'll be speaking about this even more tomorrow on WPFW in Washington, D.C., WPFWFM.org, at about 10 a.m. Eastern, with my good friend, Greg Carr of Howard University, who I've said many times, and I'll say it again, is probably one of the best read people that I know. I mean, in terms of the literature that's flooding from publishers in Black studies. So speaking of WPFW, some of the administrators are crying sabotage in terms of their operation. I'd be interested to hear if Black Power 96 feels that it's being sabotaged. Their signal is being interrupted. And some have put this in the context of the crackdown on Scott Ritter, the former arms inspector who was a critic of U.S. policy towards Russia and Israel. There was an FBI raid on his home the other day. Dimitri Simes, who was once a so-called Soviet dissident and advisor to Richard Nixon, but decided to throw in the towel and move back to Russia, where he's a supporter of the regime, but he has a residence in Virginia that was just raided the other day by the U.S. authorities. Larry Johnson, a former CIA analyst, also a stern critic of U.S. policy towards Israel and Russia. He's being harassed. So I say this as well to you other critics of U.S. imperialism. You may want to batten down the hatches.
Well, let me say that Chairman Omali Yeshitela is coming on to do a rally right after on this station, right after we go off the air. The chairman and Penny Hess and Jesse Neville will be on talking about their case as soon as Diasporic music concludes. So everyone should stay tuned for that.
Well, there you have it.
I think that's about it, my friend.
Okay.
And
go ahead.
Thank you very much for your analysis today.
Yeah, good luck to you all.
I'd like to thank Lisa Watson for